Thank you, and thank you all for being here. And let me first express my pleasure in being with Chast again. She was with me on the radio a few years ago, and we're going to talk about a whole range of things. And I'm going to learn a great deal from her, I know, and I hope you will as well, because there is a great deal to learn from her. I think I can say without embarrassing her, without making her feel any shame, that she is probably one of our greatest cartoonists and remains extraordinary in terms of the world of what she has done for humor as well. And I thought maybe we'd begin by talking about humor. Vested interest, admittedly, full confession. I did have a book out about Jewish humor, but I think a lot of your humor is Jewish and has its roots maybe going to Flatbush and Brooklyn and Jewish background.
I think that's probably to a great extent true. I mean, on the other hand, I really don't know any other kind of humor, at least well enough to work in that mode. But you know, I'm sure there is a Presbyterian humor. But yeah, I think I probably come from that tradition.
Well, your parents were both educators, and there was a sense that you were always being tested in your home. So to some extent, I suppose that reflects not only an inquisitive mind and a mind that was trained to be diligent about learning, but also, from what I've read, there was a lot of humor in your home as well.
Well, I think they both like to laugh. They definitely, it was a different sort of humor, I think, a different sense of humor than the kind of thing that I found funny. I mean, I still remember that they would have these dinner parties, and they would sit around, you know, with their other school teacher friends, and they would sit around the table, and they would tell jokes. I mean, people would actually tell jokes, but they were kind of like that thing where, like, okay, I got a new one. You know, a guy goes to the doctor, da-da-da-da-da-da, and then there would be a punchline. And everybody would be laughing. I'd be in my bedroom, I'd be hearing this, and then somebody would, like, you know, bang on the table and say, I have a new one, I have one that reminds me of this joke. And they would sort of tell these, like, little set pieces to each other. And I don't know when that kind of went out of fashion, but I don't think I've ever been at a dinner party where people, you know, did that, because it's just a whole different thing, you know?
Yeah. But did you absorb some of that, do you think, through the process? I mean, do you like jokes, for example?
Not particularly. You know, and I can't really tell them, and I think there's something sort of, I can't imagine, like, being at a dinner and everybody's talking and then sort of making everybody shut up so I can tell my little joke. I mean, you know, it just doesn't, it's a very different thing.
You would draw it rather than tell it.
Yeah, and I think the cartoon is a different sort of thing. I think with the, like, making somebody listen to a joke is aggressive in this way that, like, with a cartoon, it's like, feel free to not look at it. Although Art Spiegelman did say once in some interview that the thing about a cartoon is that it should be easier to read than it is to ignore. And I think that is certainly true for New Yorker cartoons, which is why most people, when they look at the New Yorker, they look at the cartoons first, because it's almost, to me, like a magazine within the magazine, you know, and it marches you through. And then as you're looking at the cartoons, you see articles that you might want to read and come back to, but first you have to look at the cartoons, you know. So.
Yeah, I want to talk about your development as a cartoonist, but since you mentioned Art Spiegelman, I think it's important to note that unlike Art Spiegelman, who was tremendously influenced by Crumb and a lot of the underground comics, you have talked about, in fact, I think it was Sam Gross who said, don't go to San Francisco for a job because there's only one job there, he told you, right?
Yes.
So you wound up in New York as a result of his wisdom imparting to you. But Linda Berry and some of the New Yorker cartoonists, although very different than you were the subversive cartoonist at the New Yorker, were major influences on you as opposed to, let's say, the underground comics, weren't they?
Well, Linda Berry and I think we were about the same age, about the same thing. So I don't know if she wasn't really as much, I mean, I think we were, like, influencing each other a little bit. I don't know. I mean, I loved Stan Mack. I loved Jules Feiffer. I loved Mad Magazine. I loved, Don Martin. I liked anything that really made me laugh. I loved Charles Addams. Was really my first cartoon love and continues to be my main love. I loved, I guess what they used to call it, black humor.
Because you mentioned Art Spiegelman, Mad Magazine, Jules Feiffer, all Jewish. I don't know if that's coincidental. Not Presbyterian.
Definitely not Presbyterian, yeah.
Where did you develop the style? Because I know you went to Rhode Island to study art, and at one time aspired to be a painter, didn't you?
It was a sort of default thing. When I went to Rhode Island, I drew cartoons before that, but when I went to RISD, this was in the 70s, there was very far from there was not only no cartooning department, but cartooning was thought of as like lower than almost anything you could do. And I think because, for one thing, you were trying to actually communicate with other people, which was, considered extremely tacky. And representational art was super tacky, and then worst of all, to gild that lily was you were trying to make people laugh, so that was really just bad. You were like pathetic, and better that you should be making this video art where if you had like a monitor that was just static, and then another video monitor and that was static also, and then you sort of like put them at 45-degree angles to each other. And then you wrote like a 12-page, paper about why you did this. That was thought of very highly. So when I started there, I started in the graphic design department because I thought I would be practical. And I thought that's, if I want to be an artist, I'm going to have to make a living. And so I'll study that. And I was terrible at it, and I hated it. And I switched to illustration, which I just sort of thought was a little bit boring. And I was living with painters, and they spoke about art in this way that, it was this real passion. It was like art with a capital A, and I thought, well, maybe I'll just, be a painter. But I was a terrible painter, and I really wanted to draw cartoons. And so I started drawing them just sort of secretly for myself, and then I got out of school, and everything else except the cartooning fell away, really.
But you're also, as we can plainly see here, a storyteller, almost by nature. You like to tell stories, and you like to particularly tell stories that focus on what we could call ordinary people. I'm not only including your parents in that to a great degree, but what you observe of regular, everyday people.
Yeah, regular things.
But the style, I mean, the painting itself, the drawing itself, does have its own character and does have its own kind of specific style. I mean, you can take anybody who is familiar with cartooning and give them a bunch of different wines or something. They can pick out, if they have a bunch of cartoons, Chast cartoons.
Well, I mean, for me, when I look at the New Yorker, I think, for me, what I like with New Yorker cartoons is when a cartoonist sort of has their own world. Like I know like the Charles Addams world, Ed Koren's world, Helen Hokinson's world. It's not just the individual joke. It's, that there's this whole world going on, and then every once in a while there's a funny line that kind of comes out of that world. It's not just the gag. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it makes good sense. And when you talk about going off to Rhode Island to study art, you've also talked about the years before that. In high school, you describe yourself as hostile and paranoid?
Yeah, pretty much. Which is why cartooning is just about the right profession for me. Plus, you get to work alone, and, people are great, but then at a certain point, it's just, bye.
But you appreciate the nuances and the idiosyncrasies of people, and you have that kind of eye. It really is, I would call it a gift, but it's got to be developed. It's got to be worked on, yes?
Yeah. I mean, and also it helps if you really can't do anything else. So,
You're an obsessive cartoonist? Would that be a characterization that's appropriate?
Yeah, I'm obsessive about always having to be working on a project, and sometimes it's the cartoon, sometimes it's the hooked rugs, or went through a whole Pisanki egg phase, and I get very involved with the things.
Would you say you're funny by nature, or you have to work at it?
I don't even know. I mean, I don't know. I mean, I don't really work that hard at that, but making the gags, I mean, professionally, like working on a cartoon gag is a complicated thing because, there's timing and there's boiling it down and refining it and stuff like that. So yeah, there's a lot of work that goes into writing something so that it says it sort of quickly.
I want to talk about, your work at the New Yorker and other magazines. You've distinguished yourself in so many different magazines and journals and so forth, but before we get into the New Yorker, you've had some battles there about scale and size, in fact, haven't you?
Yeah, well, real estate, the paper real estate is shrinking, and we all sort of know where paper is going. And let's just say it's shuffling off to Buffalo. Yeah, there's less paper. I mean, if you look at old New Yorkers, the drawings, some of them were full pages, some of them actually cut into the third column, and now they tend to be smaller. But I feel like this is the story of cartoonists in the 20th century. You look at Winsor McCay and these huge full-page Sunday cartoons where he could he just had this immense amount of space to draw these wonderful, elaborate artworks. And now somebody, if they're lucky, they get like 3 or 4 little boxes, and the drawings really have to be almost like stick figures. They were like boiled down to nothing. So there's that. It's just reality.
So talk about how you broke into the New Yorker, because for a young woman, there were big gates and big obstacles to get by, to put it mildly. Yes.
Well, I never really planned on being a cartoonist for the New Yorker. I mean, my goal when I was 23 was I thought if I were very, very lucky, I would get to be a cartoonist for the Village Voice, because I was working for them also. And there were so many people there. They used Stan Mack and Jules Pfeiffer and Mark Allen Stamety, and people whose work I really related to. My parents subscribed to The New Yorker, so I knew what those cartoons looked like, and I did not see myself in The New Yorker at all. My stuff was weird, and it was boxes, and it didn't have the gag line thing, and the style was totally different. But nevertheless, I called up in early 1978 to find out when their drop-off day was. And it was a Wednesday, I remember, and I brought in a drop-off day. That's the day where they take in the portfolios of people over the transom. You can just be like any ordinary Joe or Jane and just put your work in a portfolio and drop it off. That's a drop-off day. And then you come back the next week and pick it up. And so that's what I did. I dropped it off. And I went back to pick it up the next week, fully expecting, looked inside for my rejection note, and there was not a rejection note. There was a note from Lee Lorenz. I didn't even know who I didn't know who William Shawn was. I didn't know who Lee Lorenz was. I knew nothing. But there was a note saying, "Please see me, Lee." And so I showed it to the lady at the reception desk, and I said, basically something like, "What does this mean?" and what do I do now? And she said that was from Lee Lorenz, who is the art editor at the time, not the cartoon editor. He did everything. He did the covers and the cartoons, and to go back and see him. So she buzzed me in, and I went back to see him, and I was just like, well, this is certainly odd and unexpected. Then there was like a sort of outer office where the cartoonists sort of hung out together and waited to go in to see Lee, almost like the dentist, sort of like a, a waiting room. And you went in order of when you arrived. And it was just this, like, sort of, to me, a sea of old men. And they were probably like 35, some of them. But when you're like 23, like at a certain age, like your age guessing just falls off the cliff. Like after around 40, you could be 40, you could be 60, you could be 80, like who knows? And then I went in to see Lee finally, and he pulled out a cartoon, which was the weirdest cartoon I had submitted about 50 or 60 cartoons. I just didn't know how many, I just pretty much took almost everything I had. I had like 50 or 60 cartoons, and he said, we're going to buy this one. And I was pretty surprised. But then they published it a few weeks later, and he told me to start coming back on a regular basis every week, which is what I did, and what I still am doing, except now it's electronic. I don't go in person. Lee told me years later, he told me that when the New Yorker first started running my work, one of the older cartoonists asked if he owed my family money. And he said, yeah, what of it? No.
I had mentioned to Roz earlier this evening that had the pleasure of working with some of her colleagues. We had an evening of Jewish humor in New York at the 92nd Street Y, and I was on stage with Calvin Trillin and Adam Gopnik and Jeff Toobin. And originally, when we decided to do this program, there was we have to have a woman in 92nd Street Y, I said. And they said, what about Patricia Marx? And I said, great. And it worked out to be a great evening. But what I was struck by was there really is a collegiality there. There really is a sense. I mean, you are in the upper bracket now, even though you live in Connecticut, you're still, really in the club, and that exclusive company of other New Yorker writers of the first rank and so forth. There really is, for lack of a less sexist word, there really is a kind of fellowship there, isn't there?
Well, there is, to some extent.
We're all in this together?
Yeah, we're all in this together, and, yeah, maybe it's kind of like skydivers, kind of like, holding hands before you like hit the ground. I don't know.
Does Remnick, David Remnick, approve still of your cartoons? Do they go to him the way they?
Yeah. I mean, he's the big chief. He's in charge of everything.
So there's, in other words, no process by which it can't be put in the New Yorker without it being looked at by Remnick.
Right. Remnick gets final say.
Okay. And has living in Connecticut, I know, for example, I should mention, I almost said to our listeners here, that's what happens when you do too much radio. You're doing a book on New York, and you're doing a book that's coming out in October that has to do with the fact that your daughter, growing up in Connecticut in the burbs, had so little idea of how to find blocks and normal kinds of things that New Yorkers take for granted. So do you lose something in terms of your own cartoon work by living in the burbs, or do you gain more because you've certainly used that as grist for your mill, too?
Well, there's actually some of both. One thing about living outside of New York is there's many fewer distractions. So at a certain point, you're faced with that existential thing that you never have to really face in New York, which is like, there's nothing to do, I might as well work, I mean, in New York, there's always something that you can be doing, to avoid whatever, your work or whatever yourself. In Connecticut, there's just, well, I might as well, go to my studio.
But whether you're covering New York or the burbs or wherever the setting is in your cartoons, there is this kind of eye that you have, especially for detail. And I'd like you to maybe explore that a little bit with us, because it's almost like, I'll teach a writer like Chekhov, and I'll say, you realize what an eye Chekhov has for detail, how he sees things almost spectroscopically, That's probably been going on all your life, hasn't it? Little nuances and
yeah, it's probably missing the big picture, possibly. because you're, so fixated on somebody's tie or something that, like, you just, you can, no, it's true. It's true. Um, you just, you're looking at the tie. You
I'm
could.
glad I didn't wear a tie.
Yeah, you could draw the tie from memory a year from that time, but like you won't, and it won't even be like an unusual tie. It's just like you'll remember it because it'll be like maroon. It'll have like little doodads on it, but you won't have any remember what you talked about or who they were. So.
Is your memory like that, though, somewhat, I mean, not only visual, but maybe even somewhat eidetic? You see the images after you observe something and see them sharply and graphically?
I can see, yeah, there are certain things, and I was just talking to a friend tonight. I have very poor face memory, which I know Chuck Close has this also. It's actually called prosopagnosia, and so a very poor memory for that. But I have good memory for like details of fabric. Like I can remember all the furniture of the houses that I lived in, and weird. Detail, the little fringe on the bottom and like what the inside of the car looked like when I was a little kid, and the weird rope that hung. It was like this 1954 Chevy. And when I think about it, I don't even understand what it was. It was like this rope on the back of the front seat that was, of course, one piece. It wasn't like the front seats now where there's two chairs. It was like one big couch. And there was a rope that went across. And like, what was that for? Like to kind of hang on when you were like being driven someplace? It's just very weird.
Are you one of those people who remembers what people wear from years ago?
Some things, yeah.
And I'm interested also in, curious about your work and how you work. Maybe you could describe what a day is like with cartooning. You get up early and get to work right away?
Well, I read something by a fellow cartoonist that I thought, this is really it. It's like I avoid everything all the time, and then somehow magic fairies come in and like put the work together. And that is basically how it is. I mean, I'm a real procrastinator and avoider, but somehow things manage to get done. Deadlines are good. Coffee is very, very good. Having quiet, I like quiet. I do not like natural light because it moves. I, pull the blinds down, and I like the desk light, and then it's really. I mean, my son once walked by my studio, and my door was open, and he said, "Mom, what are you doing? You're like sitting there. You're like this." And a lot of what I do is just, there's a lot of sort of staring. And there's one of my fellow cartoonists, Bill Woodman, called it the blazing island of white, which is kind of it.
Do you know that people call you a graphic novelist now? Are you comfortable with that?
Well, not exactly, because, I mean, for one thing, a novel is fiction, so, but a graphic memoir, that sounds like, oh, man, that's pretty graphic, So I don't know, but I always say, when I say it, it's like this horrible sort of like mangled mouthful of like, it's a kind of like graphic novel, but it's not a novel because it's like, it's a memoir, and it's like, and then hopefully like people are able to sort of like extract what I'm trying to say from this like mouthful. But no, I'm a cartoonist. That's, what it is, and I'm a cartoonist, and I made some books.
But when, for example, you were writing about your aging parents, you were a memoirist, and you were clearly going into some territory, so to speak, that was open to vulnerabilities and open to all kinds of emotional attitudes that you had to frame and find your style and find your voice for. I'm just wondering, in fact, how did your parents respond to what you were doing, or were they aware that you were at work at the time?
No, my father died in 2007. My mother died in 2009. The book came out in 2014. When my father was alive, I don't think I was even thinking about it at all. And I can't really remember exactly when I started thinking about putting this together as a book. it might have been towards the end of my mother's life, just because I think it's also sort of naturally how I think about stuff. It's, especially when things are very stressful, it's like, it's material, it's material, it's material.
You weren't even keeping a diary or anything like that?
No. A lot of, some of the material in the book were cartoons that I had done because I submit a weekly group of cartoons to The New Yorker. Every week I submit a group of cartoons. And some of the cartoons in the book were things I had done, just as part of my weekly batch without any thought of them ever being in a book, like the Ouija board incident, or which is, I don't know if you guys have read the book where, I won't go into it, but, or a talk that I had with my mother about when she was telling me about how you could tell the degree of a woman's like sexiness or sex drive by like the height of her heels. And then she used as an example this woman she knew who was in a nursing home, and how this woman still wore like 4-inch heels. And she always had all the men at the nursing home around her. But that was like not done for the book. But when I put the book together, I included it because it fit in so well. Or, and then later when the cartoon where I'm taking my father shopping and I show him a red sweater and he tells me he can't wear it because it's red. And I said, why not? And he just whispered to me, communism. And so I did that as a cartoon and submitted it, and the New Yorker rejected it. And then a lot of the other material in the book, my research was really, a lot of it was letters that I had written to friends, emails that I had written to friends, and I used that wonderful Gmail search, and I would just pop in, my mother, or the place, or the name of my mother's aide, or Ensure, or the neurologist, or, and then it would be, in detail what I had told a friend, and I was able to use that.
Cathartic to write, though, wasn't it?
Well, I don't know. Catharsis to me implies that you're trying to rid yourself of something. I'm not sure if that's right, but for me, it was that possibly partly, but it was also that it was a way to remember. It was a way to memorialize in some ways my parents, for myself, because I hate forgetting things, and I think this certain kind of way that you can have a really wonderful experience or a terrible experience, and then eventually it all sort of fades and becomes part of this like gray mush of the past. And I wanted to preserve for myself not only what the experience of the last 10 years of my parents' lives were, but also the kinds of crazy conversations they had with each other, and just so I could hear them better in my head.
Well, you've had a stellar career and a range and diverse, I'll call it canon of work, oeuvre of work. What particularly would you like to represent? People are going to see your work here in the museum, and I hope we'll find it as fascinating as I've found it through the years. But what would you like to really represent you in terms of when you look back retrospectively? What do you think best represents you, or what do you feel would be particularly for your children and ongoing generations?
Yikes. I don't know. I just don't even think so much about that. Because I feel like, in a show like this, there's a lot of stuff, and so maybe people will have, different things will resonate for different people. So I don't know.
Different audiences mean different responses to you.
Yeah, and different, individuals, something, maybe some person will, maybe they hook rugs and they'll love that best or whatever, so.
Well, if I may say so, you've had a great deal of well-earned success, and I believe I can speak for many people in the audience when I say there's great respect for you and your work, and thank you so much for the contribution you've made. Appreciate it.
Thank
Grateful
you.
for it.